All right, so welcome to acknowledging and refuting counter arguments in your writing. So let's begin by talking about what arguments and counter arguments are. So, to begin with, our world is overflowing with differing ideas and opinions about everything, right? So, it seems that for every argument that exists, there is an opposing one. So there's the other side, there's an objection, there's an objection to an objection, and so on. So I want us to start off by just thinking about any verbal argument that we've ever had before in our lives. So no matter how ridiculous or how silly the subject of the argument was, it was an argument, meaning it was a back and forth of rhetorical claims, right? So academic argument is very similar. So let's start by talking about argument, counter argument, and so on, also known as point counterpoint. So we'll start off with an example that's not academic at all. So this is one that maybe is familiar to you, maybe not, but it's just like a student or a teenager arguing with his or her parent. So the kid says, I should be able to go to the movies with my friends as long as my homework is done. I'm 17 years old, not a baby anymore. So this is, while it's not academic, an argument. So then the parent offers the counter argument. It's a school night. You'll be so tired tomorrow that you'll learn nothing in school. The child comes back with an argument. All of my friends' parents let them go out on school nights. If I tell my friends I'm not allowed out, they'll think I'm a loser. And then the parent comes back with the counter argument. I don't care what your friends' parents do. I'm not your friends' parents. Let them think you're a loser. If they do, they weren't real friends anyway. So obviously, this is not something that you're going to write your paper about. But what I'm trying to highlight here is the idea that we are used to arguments and counter arguments in our everyday lives. What we're doing here on an academic level is trying to elevate the way we argue to a place that is more informed, more well rounded, and is more responsible. So less about shouting and waving our fingers in each other's faces and that kind of stuff, and more about making informed arguments. However, at its base, at its core, what we're doing is simply arguing our side, which, as I've tried to show here, we've been doing our whole lives, right? With our parents, our friends, whatever, about various topics. Okay. So academic argument is much the same in that it involves the point counterpoint dynamic. So rather than shouting and finger pointing, one makes an academic argument by using sound reasoning, rhetorical strategies, and points from research to make their case. Academic arguments are ongoing, oftentimes for years. When we do research, we aim to enter into the conversation about a topic. We want to weigh as many viewpoints as possible before determining our own. We also need to acknowledge that counter arguments exist. Without doing so, we run the risk of what? So we run the risk of writing an argument that is not fully fleshed out, not fully formed. Okay, the one that is might be considered invalid because it doesn't weigh all of the viewpoints that exist out there. Okay, um, so what I want to touch upon here is this idea that we are entering into academic conversations that are ongoing. So, with our research papers, what we are trying to do is not just simply find quotes that support our predetermined thesis. What you want to do is do research to help inform your thesis, to help frame your thesis. And by doing so, you're going to encounter a lot of arguments, some of which you may not agree with. If an argument is one that you do not agree with, it is now your counter argument, and it's your responsibility to acknowledge the counter arguments of all the issues that you touch upon in your writing. And if you're writing persuasively, to refute them, meaning to try to prove them wrong or weak in some way. All right. So let's talk a little bit about acknowledgement versus acknowledgement and refutation. So, no matter what kind of research writing you do, it is important to always acknowledge multiple arguments. If you're writing a piece that is less persuasive and more informative or inquiry based, such as the COVID-19 project, which many of you are doing, it's necessary to acknowledge all arguments and counter arguments. This makes this fulfills, it's a typo, your duty to your reader to provide all the relevant information available. So if you are doing the COVID-19 project or any other type of writing that is informative rather than persuasive, it's always important to acknowledge all the arguments and counter arguments that exist out there about your topic. So here's an example of simple acknowledgement of counter arguments rather than acknowledgement and refutation. Because after all, if you're not writing to persuade and you're writing simply to inform, you don't have to refute anyone's argument. You just have to simply acknowledge that there are lots of different sides of an issue. So here's one that relates to COVID. There's still a lot about living alongside novel coronavirus that is unknown. Recommendations for citizens from the government have been fluid, some changing overnight. For instance, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, initially advised against the use of masks for asymptomatic citizens. In response, many practicing health professionals spoke out, insisting that based on what they had been seeing in the field, masks would, in fact, help slow the spread. The CDC consequently reversed their advice and now recommend mask wearing when leaving the house, along with frequent hand washing and avoiding touching of the face. So in this body paragraph or this analytical paragraph, the writer has acknowledged that there were two sides to a point and gave the reader a fair, balanced view of those two sides, right? Here, the writer is writing to inform, so there's no real argument to be proven here, at least not persuasively, but there is acknowledgement of the fact that issues are not one-sided, and points of issues or aspects of issues are not one-sided. There's usually differing takes on topics. Okay. All right. So acknowledgement versus acknowledgement and refutation. Let's talk about acknowledgement and refutation. So when you're writing persuasively, it's important that you not only acknowledge that there are opposing arguments to your own, but also to refute them explicitly. So when you're writing to persuade, which some of you are doing, especially those of you who are doing the America Today project, that means that you're strengthening your argument by showing fundamental weaknesses in the counter argument. So you are acknowledging the counter argument, you're acknowledging that opposing views exist, and then you are taking them down, so to speak. So you're poking holes in them. You are saying that they are not valid or that they are weak. And you're doing so in a way that is explicit and informed and based on your own reasoning that has been informed by your research. So here's an example of acknowledgement and refutation. So in this paragraph, I've changed the color of some of the font to just highlight a couple things. So first of all, we have the acknowledgement of the counter argument. So some bioethicists argue that this next wave of performance enhancement is an acceptable and unavoidable feature of competition. So this writer has acknowledged the counter argument. He's going to give some more information about the counter argument. Maybe even some of it is valid. As Dr. Andy Mia, who supports the regulated use of gene therapies in sports, claims, the idea of the naturally perfect athlete is romantic nonsense. An athlete achieves what he or she achieves through all sorts of means, technology, sponsorship, support, and so on, quoted in Rudebeck. Maya, in fact, sees athletes' imminent turn to genetic modification as merely a continuation of the way sport works. It allows us to create more extraordinary performances as the goal of competition reflects our culture's tendency to demand and reward new heights of athletic achievement. However, now that the counter argument has been acknowledged and expanded upon and supported with expert opinion, the writer is going to start to refute that opinion. The problem is that achievement nowadays increasingly results from biological and high tech intervention rather than strictly hard work. And so now the writer is going to go from here into another supporting paragraph or supporting section that is further going to take apart the argument of the bioethicists who say that it's a natural next wave in the world of sports, saying that really what's at stake here is hard work, and hard work is being eliminated. So whether or not you agree with the writer here, you can see that he has acknowledged that there is a camp of people who disagree with him. And now what he's going to do is start to take apart their argument or start to argue back with them by offering his own counter argument. All right. So we need to acknowledge and refute effectively. So what we have here is what's called the hierarchy of disagreement by this, he's a writer, his name is Paul Graham. And basically what this shows is that the more explicitly one refutes a central point, the stronger the argument is. So Graham names some of the other methods of disagreement in descending order of efficacy, with ad hominem and name calling being the least effective. So basically what this guy Graham did is he said, okay, there's a whole lot of ways that we can disagree. Some of them are more effective than others. And he put them into a triangle, with the top, the peak, being what we want to get toward, what we want to work toward, and the bottom rungs being the least effective forms of arguing. So if we start from the bottom and go up, we have name calling. So that's the cheapest way of opposing a counter argument, right? Is to resort to name calling. So it sounds something like "you are an asshat," which is obviously pretty funny. We wouldn't write that in a paper anyway, but we don't want to resort to just simply labeling the other side as ignorant or as stupid or any other kind of names that are derogatory or reductive. That just makes our argument seem weak because it seems petty. It appears as if you can't really get into the nitty gritty of the argument. You can't make your point without resorting to name calling. So above that, we have ad hominem, which is basically when you attack the character of the writer or the person who's presenting the opposing side rather than their point. So, presenting a quote from the opposing side of your argument and then saying, well, that's just something that a typical Democrat would say, or that's just something that a typical Republican would say, or of course a senator would say something like that, or of course a man, or of course a woman would say something like that. It reduces the opposing side to simply a character assassination. Or it really just reduces your argument to a character assassination and reduces the opposing side to just a set of characteristics as if they don't have a valid point. And they may have some valid points. So it's important to highlight the points that the opposing side makes that may be valid while also refuting the central point altogether. Then we have responding to tone, criticizes the tone of the writing without addressing the substance of the argument. So if you are only attacking a counter argument for sounding too angry or sounding too smug, and you're simply just kind of attacking its tone, then you're not actually engaging with the argument. Above that, we have contradiction, states the opposing case with little or no supporting evidence. So if you say you disagree, but then you don't give any reason why you disagree, that's simply contradiction. That's kind of like that because I said so, or because that's just my opinion, that kind of reasoning. It's not very effective, right? Then we have simple counter argument, which is where you contradict and you back up with reasoning and or supporting evidence. Now we're getting somewhere good. Above that, we have counter argument coupled with refutation, which is where you find the mistake and explain why it's mistaken using quotes. And then at the top, we have refuting the central point, which is the most effective way to argue, which is where you explicitly refute the central point of the opposing argument by doing all of the things that come immediately below, not on the bottom half of the triangle, but by finding the mistake, explaining why it's a mistake, and using quotes, and also contradicting and backing up with reasoning and or supporting evidence. So you kind of take like that second and third layer, combine them, and then you've got the peak there. That's good acknowledgement and refutation. Okay. All right. So just to quickly review what we've done so far, in the points and examples we have seen thus far, we've determined the following. First of all, it's important to acknowledge multiple viewpoints on an issue you're writing about. Second, when writing to inform, arguments and counter arguments should be acknowledged objectively. And third, when writing to persuade, counter arguments to your own should be both acknowledged and refuted to strengthen your work. Let's talk about a few more things. Counter arguments can be simply acknowledged in body paragraphs, or depending on your topic, sometimes your entire thesis is founded on a counter argument. So your entire thesis, and thus the main thrust of your paper, can be about refuting a counter argument. So think about the American myth paper. What I asked you to do for that paper was find an American myth and then challenge it. So essentially what you were doing there was you were creating a thesis and thus an entire paper that was founded upon a counter argument. So here's an example of a thesis from that set of papers. While the nuclear family has long been considered the standard for all Americans to aspire to, the American family makeup is formed along lines of race, class, and socioeconomic status. So if you look at that thesis statement, the first part, while the nuclear family has long been considered the standard for all Americans to aspire to, that's acknowledging the counter argument. And then right after the comma, we get into the refutation of the counter argument. So now this is your argument back. The American family makeup is formed along lines of race, class, and socioeconomic status. So this paper's entire foundation is based on acknowledging and refuting counter argument. Sometimes the most direct way to make your point is to make your thesis dissent-based. Okay. Whoops, sorry, give me 1 second. Okay. Really quickly, I'd like to just talk about how to um, put or slip your counter argument into your sentences. So this is just brass tacks, like how do you actually make it work within your paragraphs. So here are some templates for you to use. This, I think, would be very helpful for you guys if you're still unsure how to introduce counter arguments into your writing. These templates will help you smoothly introduce and refute your counter arguments. So we have, although, summary of counter arguments, comma, dot, 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 your refutation. So that's similar to the one we just saw, right? Although the nuclear family, blah, 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 comma, now we have our refutation. It is actually formed along lines of race, class, socioeconomic status. Okay, here's another. Proponents of counter argument might maintain, argue, claim, contend that blank, explain the counter argument. However, and then you refute the counter argument. Okay, another template. One or some claim that blank, the counter argument. However, blank, and then you have your refutation. Next one. Many liberal politicians, doctors, labor union members, whatever, many blank argue that blank, and then that's the counter argument. However, and then you offer your refutation. And then finally, the essence of X's argument is that, and then you introduce the essence of the argument, which is in opposition to yours. Such a stance is, and then an adjective, dangerous, inadequate, weak, etc., because blank, and then you enter your refutation. All right. So here are just a few final examples. And then after that, I will take some questions from you guys if you have them. So here is a selection from a paper on safe traveler cards. So here the writer starts off by introducing the opposing arguments, which I've highlighted in red. Then what he or she does here is acknowledge the valid parts of the counter argument, then offers their own counter argument, right? The refutation, and then concludes. So we have here, as attractive as safe traveler cards or national ID cards are, they are not without drawbacks. For one thing, as Easterbrook notes, these cards would expedite security procedures only for travelers who do not mind volunteering such information to obtain a card. Moreover, they would not prevent passengers with clean backgrounds from bringing weapons or explosives on board, as was the case in the September 11th attacks. Perhaps the biggest drawback is that some people believe that these cards would deprive people of their privacy, and that for this reason, their disadvantages outweigh their advantages. However, there are many who disagree with these contentions. Now he's going to acknowledge, or she's going to acknowledge, the valid points of those who disagree. While national ID cards could lessen a person's anonymity and privacy, now the counter argument. This is a small loss that would be offset by a great increase in personal security. To Dershowitz, a self-proclaimed civil libertarian, this trade-off would be well worth it. According to Dershowitz, the national ID card would be only a little more intrusive than a photo ID card or social security card. Best of all, it would reduce or eliminate the need for racial profiling. Anyone who had the national ID card could be allowed to pass through airports or building security more expeditiously, and anyone who opted out could be examined much more closely. Such cards would enable airport security officials to do instant background checks on everyone. And now the conclusion, or wrapping up this section before moving on. The personal information in the system would stay in the system and never be made public. The only information on the card would be a person's name, address, photo, and fingerprint, from Dershowitz, page 591. Okay, so here's one really skilled example. And here's one more. This is from an essay on charter schools versus public schools. So again, the counter argument is acknowledged, valid points of the counter argument are acknowledged, then the refutation is offered, and then a wrap up before moving on to the next section. So this reads, considering the many challenges facing public schools, it's understandable that many people would be eager to pursue new options. Supporters of school choice point out that under the current public school system, parents with economic means already exercise school choice by moving from areas with failing or dangerous schools to neighborhoods with better, safer schools. Their argument is that school choice would allow parents the freedom, regardless of income level, to select the school that provides the best education. Chubb and Moe. Schools would then have to compete for students by offering higher academic results and greater safety. Schools unable to measure up to the standards of successful schools would fail and possibly close. So, acknowledging the valid parts, activists within the school choice movement can be applauded for seeking to improve public education, but the changes they propose would in fact seriously damage public education as a whole. So now here's the refutation. One of the biggest dangers of school choice is the power behind large corporations specializing in opening and operating charter schools. Two notable companies are Green Dot, which is the leading public school operator in Los Angeles, and KIPP, KIPP, those are the Knowledge is Power schools, which operate 65 schools in 19 different states. These companies represent a growing trend of privatization of public schools by large corporations. It is feared that these corporations could grow to a point that public control of education would be lost. Education policy would be left in the hands of entrepreneurial think tanks, corporate boards of directors, and lobbyists who are more interested in profit than educating students. And then that was a paraphrase from Miller and Gerson. Education should be left in the hands of professional educators and not business people with MBAs. To do otherwise is not only dangerous, it defies common sense. Okay, so those were two examples. I want to finish off by just taking a look at Aristotle's rhetorical triangle. So most of you guys probably did this in high school, or if not, maybe in 111. You should have seen this sometime before. But basically, the idea behind the rhetorical triangle is that we are always trying to balance logos, ethos, and pathos with or in the minds of our readers. So logos meaning appeal to intellect, pathos meaning appeal to pity or empathy or to feeling or emotion, and ethos being an appeal to ethics or character. And what you do here when you acknowledge the counter argument is you improve your paper's ethos. So what that means is you elevate your character in the mind of the reader. So you, in other words, are establishing yourself as someone who has done your homework, you've done your research, you are not biased, or if you are showing bias, it is an informed bias, right? And that you are not living in a vacuum, so to speak, that you have sought out and evaluated and weighed in on other arguments. And so your argument is valid, right? It is not simply an opinion for the sake of an opinion. It's an opinion that is supported by a preponderance of evidence and reasoning. Okay. All right. So I'm going to open up to any questions you guys might have for me.
Is there an outline for the next paper?
Which one? This one?
Yeah.
Did you hand in your draft?
No.
Okay. The draft was due
Okay.
on Monday. So this week I'm marking all the drafts and giving them back so that you get notes for the final revision, which is due the 11th. Any other questions? All right, guys. So I'm going to end the meeting. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you're all safe and healthy. And I hopefully will see you soon. Bye bye.